Joining to discuss in our Google Hangout, we have Director of the Brave New Foundation's War Costs Campaign, John Amick, Investigator for the Project on Government Oversight, Ben Freeman, and journalist and BuzzFeed correspondent Michael Hastings, whose book, The Operators, The Wild and Terrifying Inside Story of America's War in Afghanistan, came out yesterday on paperback. So good for you. Welcome, everyone.
What's up?
Hey.
Hello.
Thanks for joining me today. Oh, so where do we begin? 70% of retired 3- and 4-star generals took these jobs. John, you know, your organization, along with Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, you guys worked on this report. Were you shocked at all by the results? Or, you know, like I said, in prior years, the number had actually been higher. So maybe was that part surprising?
I think, and thanks for having me, I think that given that the previous report was 80%, we weren't necessarily shocked, but nevertheless, that doesn't mean that we found it any less pernicious. This prime pillar of the military-industrial complex, the revolving door phenomenon, where generals and admirals will use the knowledge they've gained working for the public and then go and, as soon as they retire, cash in with defense contractors and consultants, is frankly always shocking. I shouldn't say this report wasn't shocking. It's always shocking. And especially some of the individual examples that the report found, such as James Cartwright. James Cartwright retired from the Marines in September of 2011. He was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is, of course, a high-ranking position. Once he retired, he joined what was called the Defense Policy Board, which advises the Secretary of Defense on defense policy matters. This is supposed to be an independent board. He also, not long after he retired, joined Raytheon's board of directors. Raytheon's the top 5 contractor. And he also joined a couple of other advisory boards. So I think Cartwright's the prime example. When the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff leaves this position and cashes in, I mean, why wouldn't any other 3- or 4-star general do this? So that's a prime example.
Now, for the most part, too, just, you know, for average people that are trying to look at this, would you say that it's the big names that stick out the most? You know, you talk about the top 5 defense contractors. Is this where the majority of these generals are going to, or are there a lot of other smaller firms involved as well that perhaps we've never even heard of?
Oh, definitely smaller firms are involved. I think the top 5 are easy to pick out, and that's what the report focused on the most. And I'm sure Ben can talk about some of the other smaller contractors, but I think it's across the board. It's not necessarily the top 5.
Well, Ben, maybe you can elaborate for us then. I mean, I know that you guys, you know, also try to actively fight against this being a possibility for generals to do.
Yeah, absolutely. What you basically see is it's almost like a headhunter market for these generals whenever they leave their commands, because they're in such powerful positions, and the people that were under them, they look up to them so much, and they have all those connections built in. So these contractors, they want, the higher the contractor, the more attractive they are to some of these big firms. But the little firms are looking for them too. And so what you see is basically, if you're any sort of contractor, you're gunning for these guys, and whoever can offer the biggest and the best compensation packages, well, they're the ones that typically end up with them.
All right, so then why is it that they are gunning for these guys? And Michael, feel free to join in whenever you want to. I mean, how does this actually affect the decision-making that's done in Washington, D.C., and to where the funds are allocated, you know, and to who is fighting for one project or one policy or another? Anyone?
Sure. I mean.
Can you? I'm sorry, Michael. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you guys. Look. I mean, I guess one could ask, do we want these generals? They're not going to go work at McDonald's, you know. I mean, they already have these, you know, sweet retirement deals, and you know, so with that, they then go and they tap their connections and they feed off, you know, what's a $700 billion a year budget. So you know, along with all these, they not only have access to these contracts and jobs here, you know, they have access to these positions overseas as well. Often they'll go back and end up with sort of, they'll recreate the same group of folks they had together in the military, in the private sector, and that that's fairly, not only when these guys retire will they take these jobs, they'll also recruit the most talented people out of the military to go work for them in many cases.
But so, I mean, is there an argument to make? You just said they're not going to go and work at McDonald's. What's a general to do after he retires if he, if he still has some energy in him and doesn't actually want to just retire and disappear?
You could go run the CIA. That was one. That was one option. No, I mean, look, they're doing. They have books. They'll may write the occasional book. So there's, I think, plenty of things. I mean, it's. I think one of the things that I think which is true is that the practice has gotten so widespread that, in fact, it's expected, right? It's part of the retirement package almost in a lot of cases.
I think the real nefarious thing about it isn't necessarily that they're going to work for the contractors. It's everything that comes with that. It's those apparent conflicts of interest. It's the, as Michael pointed out very astutely, they're pulling good people from the DOD into contractors. And then, of course, when they're working for the contractors, they're being paid 2 and 3 times what they were at the DOD. And so ultimately, this really raises costs for taxpayers, and we're basically getting the exact same work done, but we're paying 2 and 3 times as much for it. I think those are the things that are really problematic about it. I don't necessarily think that there's any organization that says a general shouldn't be able to work in the military arena afterwards. It's just, can we eliminate those conflicts of interest and all the bad things that go with it?
But so then how would you guys like to see this play out? If you're not going to say that you should all out be banned from being able to go work in the private sector after you retire, I don't think, like you said, no one is going to go that far. But do you think that we need to put time limits on it, that you have to wait 1, 2, 3 years, or perhaps even more? What would be a reasonable way to approach it?
I'd like to see significantly longer cooling off periods. I think some of the examples that John and crew found in the report are really glaring about people just immediately crossing over and working for a contractor and simultaneously advising the Pentagon. Well, there's a clear conflict of interest there to me. So we've got to increase that time period, that cooling off period. So we know, at the very least, you're not going to have as much of a conflict of interest.
Well, then that's the really crazy part. And John, maybe you can elaborate on that too, right? Is that you can be working for a defense contractor, simultaneously advising the Pentagon. It could not be any more obvious that there's a conflict of interest there. But can't you create some kind of rules that would at least, stop that?
Sure. I mean, I think right now, and either of you correct me if I'm wrong, if you know, but I think it's about a year where someone like a general that goes to a contractor can't lobby the people that he worked with formerly. That doesn't necessarily mean that he can't work in the industry or for a consultant for a year. Because of another example in the report is someone that went from the Pentagon, from the Navy to a contractor, Northrop Grumman, and literally the same day. The day he officially retired is when they named him head of some kind of cybersecurity sector. So I think right now it's about a year, but that doesn't mean that they have to wait a year. And like Ben said, at least tacking on several more years, and even then, I'm not sure if that's enough. I mean, I guess that's open for debate whether 3, 4, 5 years is even enough to where someone can leave the Pentagon and still be out of that realm where they don't know anybody. But I find that hard to believe. I feel like they'll still have contacts, they'll still know people, and the problem will persist. So I don't know if there's a amount of time, 5 years is enough, but at least having the debate is where it should begin, and not just a year where they can't lobby their former coworkers or anything like that. I think it's got to be much more than that.
But so then whose responsibility is it to really spark up that debate? Is this some kind of legislation that we have to see passed via Congress, or these rules that the Pentagon can just enforce upon its own personnel? Whose hands does that lie in?
I mean, I would assume it's up to Congress. The revolving door isn't just limited to the Pentagon. I mean, that happens in Congress as well. Part of the report went into congressional staff members. They found that of the top 5 defense contractors, their lobbyists for the first quarter of 2012, 68% of those lobbyists had public sector experience, whether in Congress, working for a member of Congress, or within another federal agency. So it goes beyond the Pentagon, and I think Congress is part of the problem too, just like with so many other things. So it's a widespread problem that touches not only Congress and the Pentagon, but other federal agencies.
Well, yeah, like I was saying, there are many revolving doors in Washington, D.C., right? Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
But I mean, I think if you're going to like step back and look at, okay, what's the problem here? Obviously, the conflict of interest are a problem, but at the root cause of it is you have this huge wave of money that's being spent on like I said, $700 billion a year for the Pentagon. It's the country's largest employer. I mean, so until you start when there's so much incentive there, I don't see how people are going to resist. I mean, I think they're going to go for the money every time, especially when there's that much out there. So I think the conversation, obviously, always gets back to, this huge bureaucracy that a lot of people are making a living off of.
Well, I mean,
this may be.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think this may be one area where the fiscal cliff can actually be very useful for the revolving door issue, because as Michael said, you've got $700 billion out there, and when the money's flowing, people are just going to go for the money. So if we, and by the way, more than half of that goes to the defense contractors, more than $350 billion a year we give to defense contractors. And so what we need is to take some of that money out of the equation. And then if the Pentagon really has to choose between paying contractors more, paying these ex-generals and admirals more, or keeping more of that money in-house, well, hopefully they'll decide to give more of it to the troops and cut back on some of these revolving doors.
So I guess maybe we shouldn't be all that surprised when we hear a lot of military officials talk about the fiscal cliff and the trigger effect that will go into effect, and call it the doomsday mechanism, right? Because they might know that it's going to bite them down the line too. But there's another element that I'd like to bring up in this as well. And Michael, maybe you can start us off with this. What about just generals that are getting checks from defense contractors that are then also getting checks from maybe media organizations to
maybe
right, to then be a pundit that we're supposed to look at as someone who also is, unbiased at that point?
Well, I mean, that was the great David Barstow investigative piece from a few years ago in the Times, where he documented quite clearly that, retired military officers were getting regular briefings from the Pentagon's press operation, not disclosing that and going on TV as kind of unbiased, independent, not unbiased, independent experts. And when, after that was exposed in the Times, there were a couple investigations internally, but no one was punished and nothing really came of it. And the practice continues. You turn on some of the networks, and they're filled with these kinds of folks. So, the prestige is there, the money's there. That's it's
so defeatist, but I guess this is just the way things work. But yeah,
no, there should be an ethical code that our media organizations and our large government bureaucracies follow, and that should be enforced. And one of the codes should be don't be corrupt. I mean, it's pretty simple. You don't need a lot of laws to sort of to say, look, guys, like when you're being corrupt, we all know it. So stop it, cut it out. I think that's doable. I think you change the values of I think it's kind of a values issue, and I think you can make those arguments, and I think people should.
Well, so John, I'm curious, how have people been responding to this report that you put out? Is it kind of what all of us are saying here on this panel, which is, well, not shocked at all. This is the military-industrial complex. This is just the way things are, or has it gotten some people riled up?
Unfortunately, I think it's the former, that this is just part of the system that we live in, and what can we do about it? And I think, describing this phenomenon to people that have not heard of it before, in my experience, it takes 5 or 10 minutes at least to get them to come to the point where they say, oh, well, I guess I can see why that's something that we should avoid, but that doesn't mean they're riled up about it. But I think a couple of things come to mind with all of this. The military is consistently found to be one of the most respected, if in polls, one of the most respected institutions in the country at this point. And it also brings to mind a book I've read before about Dwight Eisenhower and his speech about the military-industrial complex. And, in his day, or maybe even before that, and I understand the Pentagon's a different animal than it was then, but how if any general did something like this, if they went to a contractor, if they went to work for an industry that was perceived to be a war profiteer, that they were shunned by their colleagues, and it was really looked down upon. And it struck me that now it's completely different, that everyone's trying to get in on it. So, I don't know how those two connect off the spot, but on one hand, the military is still respected by vast majority of people in this country, more than most other institutions. And also you can see how it's changed a little bit over time, that generals didn't do this always. It hasn't been always the same phenomenon. I guess the difference in how big the Pentagon is now plays some part into it, but it's just interesting to see these patterns over time.
Well, I guess it's interesting, too, to see how much, maybe a sex scandal with a general, how much attention and coverage that gets versus something like this, which so clearly points out some of the corruption there, too. But, Ben, do you think that we need some stronger factors to actually tie it together? So you can say that, OK, these generals then end up leaving the Pentagon and then they go into the private sector, and you can talk about how much money is awarded to some of the defense contractors, but those are really weak ties. You could look at perhaps how these contractors do on the stock market, right? And if they get a big general that signs on, then maybe their stock will tick up a bit. But still, is that enough to really pinpoint it to say, look, there's a direct correlation here?
Yeah, well, fortunately, there's been some pretty good scientific work done on exactly that question you mentioned about stock prices. And it's found that when the company reports hiring a big-time general or admiral, their stock price actually does go up. Now, does that translate into some sort of nefarious, getting more contracts or not? We can't say for sure. But what we do know from anecdotal evidence, at least, is that a lot of these guys, they are going back and talking to a lot of their same buddies, people they once commanded, and they are getting a lot done because of those connections. And whether that's good, bad, or ugly, it's tough to say. But for those of us that look at the DoD acquisitions process, we see a lot of problems with it. And what we'd rather have the DoD do, rather than relying on the good old boy system, is try to find the products that are best. Try to find the best products at the cheapest prices and go on merit rather than just on who you know.
I think that sounds, that sounds fair, and it sounds like it makes a lot of sense. I guess the question just is, how do you actually do it, And there are a lot of people that have different opinions on it, too. We've got a comment that was posted on HuffPost says, I don't know why people are upset. That's what a lot of military people do. I work as a contractor, and we have one civilian, never military, who works with us. He's useless. Prior military personnel are hard workers. They need jobs, too. We need to stop demonizing contract work. It's cheaper to pay for contractors than it is for government employees. Can we say anything to things like that? How do we not try to demonize?
No, contractors have feelings too, and the point I've made the point in my book. It's like they're an easy, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're an easy scapegoat to blame the country's some of our problems on. But I don't keep asking for what's going to be the solution to all this, except. But the only answer is really just sort of discussing it and talking about it and trying to figure out if there's actually any political will to get control of the kind of out of control spending.
Well, I don't quite see any political will. Do the rest of you?
I do. I see it in the streets. I see it in the people's eyes, when they get inspired. And I saw it, occasionally it passes by.
Yeah, there's some political will right now to at the very least, to lower the cap on executive compensation at contractors. Right now, contractors can bill in the range, actually over $750,000 per employee. And there's a proposal to take that down at least below the president's level right now, which sort of makes sense. Ironically enough, a lot of taxpayers probably don't know that more of their taxpayer dollars may be going to an employee of a contractor than to the president under current law. So there's a proposal that would fix that and lower the amount of reimbursement that taxpayers can be on the hook for some of these, generals and admirals who go through the revolving door. We think that's a good start, good legislation. Beyond that, it's really tough to get people moving on this.
Yeah, so there are a few examples. Now, I don't mean that there's no political will out there either. I've definitely, spoken to a lot of people, clearly organizations like yours. There's a reason that you guys care, that you want to compile these numbers so you can get the information out there. But we really need to start, seeing some of that movement in action at the higher echelons, which that's the part I'm a little bit skeptical of. So I'm going to wrap it up. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thanks.